Today's webinar is super exciting, volunteer monitoring, building credibility. In a day and age where everyone is scrutinizing data, it's always great to look at our own programs and identify the diverse ways that we can build credibility within them. And for today's webinar, I am so thrilled to introduce our two amazing panelists, Linda Green and Ginny Monismith. Linda Green is the program director of the University of Rhode Island Watershed Watch, and I like to refer to Linda as one of the monitoring mamas. I think that Linda Green's name is synonymous with volunteer monitoring, and she has shown our field such amazing leadership and expertise in her 30 years of being the program director at University of Rhode Island's Watershed Watch. Linda was the first representative of the volunteer monitoring community on the National Water Quality Monitoring Council. She represented our community for 10 years. And also, in addition to that, and really helping to pave the way for some of us younger folks in the field, she was a part of this wonderful collaboration through USDA and Extension, and she's going to be highlighting some of these resources that they had put together through that grant, which I tend to think of as some of those standard practices in our shared community of practice. So Linda offers amazing leadership and to the field and has done so much and achieved so much for volunteer monitoring throughout her tenure. And while Linda is retired in theory, she's still very active and engaged, working full weeks and contributing amazingly to our field, including during today's webinar. So thank you, Linda Green, for joining us today. I'm also very honored to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Ginny Monismith. Ginny is the Assistant Director for the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring housed in Dickinson College. And for 10 years, she has trained Pennsylvania communities to develop and implement successful stream monitoring programs. She's also helped to elevate the ALLARM lab to being the quality assurance lab for volunteer monitors in the state, and has even been able to offer those resources to volunteers in Virginia and West Virginia. I should mention that Linda is also a grandmother, and Ginny is an amazing mother to two kids, Bryce and Bryn, and just so thrilled to have both of you on today's webinar to talk about volunteer monitoring, building credibility. So to give everyone a sense of where we are and where we're going with today's webinar, we just did introductions, and then I'm going to hand it over to Linda Green, who's going to really root us in the framework of building credibility, and then she'll pass it over to Ginny to talk about those principles and rooting them within community examples. And then we're going to aim to save the last 10-15 minutes for Q&A. And for those of you who are just joining the webinar now, please type your questions into the chat function, send it to all panelists, and we'll be tracking those questions and saving them for the end. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Linda Green to get started.
Thanks, Julie. One slight correction. I'm not retired, still working. But, and intend to do that for quite a while. I'm thrilled to be on this webinar today and talking with all of you about enhancing credibility in volunteer monitoring programs. And what I'm talking about today is really the product of a collaboration, including Elizabeth Herron, who runs the Watershed Watch program with me, Chris Stepanuck, now at University of Vermont Sea Grant and Extension, and with a lot of help over the years from folks at Alabama Water Watch, Bill Deutsch, Montana State University, Adam Siegler, excuse me, and so I'd like to get going. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next. Okay, great. So volunteer monitoring is alive and well and flourishing actually across our country. Chris Stepanuck has done a lot of research trying to figure out how many programs are there, and we've determined that somewhere in the range of 300 to 350 standalone or parent programs now, over 1,600 affiliated programs, which really translates to about 103,000 volunteers per year and about 31,000 sites monitored, which is fantastic. And we know that there are definitely some characteristics of successful citizen science programs in general, that they're well organized, they have a sound scientific basis, they're respectful of their volunteers, they have strong organizational support, report and use the results, and make a difference. And that's a hallmark of all our very fine programs. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be talking to you today is based on a set of fact sheets that were developed by the Volunteer Monitoring Network. Thanks to some fantastic funding we had for 12 years that we stretched to 14 from USDA's National Integrated Water Program. And that program and funding ended in 2012. We stretched this out, and what we've tried to do is keep our fact sheets up to date and available for everybody. So they are on the website listed here. They're also on the National Water Quality Council's volunteer monitoring website. And the way we put together these fact sheets was based on listserv queries to the volunteer monitoring community, based on lots of Google searches, really delving into programs, and these fact sheets were mostly written by Elizabeth Heron and Chris Stepanek. Okay, next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned before, the characteristics of successful programs, the important one is that they have a sound scientific basis, that they're clear monitoring goals, a written study design, good documentation, everything that's done is appropriate to the capabilities of the program, and the quality assurance is appropriate for data use. And this aspect of matching is very important. Next slide, please. But the most important aspect is recognizing that credibility really doesn't mean that you have to measure things in the most exacting way. It means that you're delivering on your promises. And that's the key to everything we do. Next slide. So it's tempted to say that what you want to do is start with the end in mind and really think about why you're starting a citizen science or volunteer monitoring project. And tempting as that is for me to delve into that today, that topic has actually been covered by one of the prior webinars, Volunteer Monitoring Starting Strong. And that is on the website, the ACWI Volunteer Monitoring Webinars website, and available for all of you to check out. So next slide. So what I'm going to focus on today is talking a little bit beyond that. And our colleague Jeff Dates many years ago came up with this fantastic graphic that really describes the volunteer monitoring continuum, because there are many goals and many rationales for many programs. Some are education and awareness programs, such as Earth Echo, which used to be the World Water Monitoring Challenge. Many of the states and of the listed programs that Chris has found that are for baseline ID, assessing impairments, local decisions, and some of the programs that have made the stretch to do work that's part of legal or regulatory frameworks, whether that might be listing or delisting sites with the state's TMDL program or other aspects. But the important thing to recognize is as you go from left to right in this continuum, to have a good program, it takes more time on the end of the people who are organizing it and running it, more time in the efforts of the volunteer. The programs need to be much more rigorous in what they're doing. They must have a higher level of quality assurance, and it costs more money. So it's important to figure out where you want to be in that. Next slide. So Alabama Water Watch has a great graphic that kind of encapsulates this in a slightly different way and in a way that captures how they have approached what they do for their program, using the pendulum, swinging from something that might be very easy to do using test strips to the other end, something that's not doable is having a good laboratory, analytical laboratory, and something in the middle that works for them, which is doing things that are doable and meaningful with monitoring kits and other aspects such as that. Next slide, please. So when you think about it, and I don't have an exact citation for this, but from what I understand, the most widely used monitoring tools are thermometers and Secchi discs. These are very simple tools, easy for just about anybody to use properly. They're fairly indestructible, but we have to remember that even to use something as simple like this, you want to make sure you've got an annual calibration and that you're checking to make sure that the thermometers are working the way they are. In the Watershed Watch program, we have about 200 thermometers in use at any year, and when we take them back at the end of the season to calibrate them, we usually end up having to discard about 20 of them or more because they are just not meeting the range of measurements. And then when we order in a new set, we put them through that same calibration and often end up getting back in touch with a company because they still don't meet our QC standards, even though they're brand new. Next slide. So when you think about what you have to use and you want to assess what's possible, it's important to think of who you're going to work with and what you're going to do. You really need to think about the skills and knowledge of the group you're working with. Importantly, what your financial resources are, the users and the uses of the data, and the level of commitment on all ends. And amongst our fact sheets, we have developed a matrix of monitoring activities that kind of can help you through this process to try and think about which steps you want to follow and where you want to might aim what you're doing. Okay, next slide. And there are many programs actually, such as Wisconsin's Water Action Volunteers, that actually have a tiered monitoring approach where the volunteers and the coordinators can pick the level that the volunteer is being done at, whether it's an introductory monitoring program, one that's much more rigorous, the status and trends, and then the special projects monitoring that require much more training and may require much more interaction with scientists for their projects. Next, please. And so now I want to delve into a little bit of what we call the data quality system, and that is encapsulated in our fact sheet. And it's all about the whole program to think about, and it's very important to think about it all in full before you get started. And Ginny's going to go into a lot more of the details. And really, to start off, you want to plan what your quality assurance is going to be, what your study design is going to be, developing your quality assurance plan, thinking about the training materials you have. And then once you get underway, you want to make sure you're implementing your quality control, the things you thought of before, the training, following procedures, the proficiency testing, the quality assurance parties with your volunteers, the way to make sure that what's going on is meeting what you say it's going to do. And then afterwards, after your programs are over or after the year, that's the time to review, evaluate, correct, see what you want to change for the next year. Next slide, please. And there's many ways of assuring quality. First and foremost, having written procedures, and then adhering to those established written procedures and not going off on tangents. Training and more training, always important to make it flow through your program. To make sure your sampling is routine, that you have some kind of repetition between replicates and duplicates, if possible, that you're monitoring multiple indicators, and that you have a good quality assurance and quality control program. And most importantly, you address your volunteers' questions. Because if you don't do that, you may not have success in what you're doing, and you may not have volunteer success, and they may not want to continue. Next slide, please. So you want to think of what level of quality your data need to be. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. I kind of glossed over them, so I'm not going to name them in detail now. Next slide. So one of the things you want to think about, and when you think about that continuum slide, is the sensitivity. And that's the ability to differentiate between levels, or otherwise known as resolution. And an easy example of that is pH paper, where you can have something simple such as litmus paper, you can use test strips, you can use color comparators, pocket pH testers, which have really increased in their usability now, or whether your program needs to have pH measured using a laboratory instrument, something that measures to maybe a tenth or 100th of a pH unit. Excuse me. It all depends how your program is going to use pH. If you're doing a simple education program, test strips are great, nice visual results. If you're trying to address ocean acidity, you definitely want to use a much more complex instrument. Next slide, please. And you also want to think about what the lowest level is that you can measure. There are lots of kits and meters that say they measure to 0. Well, 0 is pretty hard to measure. And you need to think about your area and what will work for you. For example, let's talk about measuring dissolved phosphorus. You can get test tabs that can measure phosphorus in whole numbers in parts per million. You can get color comparators that measure in tenths of parts per million. On the much more expensive scale are spectrophotometers that measure way down, maybe to 3 parts per billion. If I'm interested in measuring this phosphorus in northeast lakes, the phosphorus levels are generally very low. So having those test tabs or comparators just wouldn't work. If you want to measure that as part of your program, you need to go to that expense. And that could be a very considerable expense. Next one. Next slide, please. And there are also many, many steps you can take for improving accuracy, precision, and actually trying to minimize the bias in your program. And I realize I'm glossing over all of this, but here we go. Analyzing blanks, and that's taking purified water and taking them out in the field with you, bringing them back and testing them as if it was a sample. Using that same kind of water in your lab just to run through your process. Measuring samples of known concentration. When I was working on developing a winter monitoring program, and also on our saltwater sites, we had been using a Lamont kit for measuring salinity and then discovered that we had to pay hazardous waste for some of the reagents. So I decided to see about using a salinity refractometer. And I ordered a number and found all of them were able to measure 0 very well, but only the one that cost about $200 could actually measure the 20 parts per thousand salinity as a test. So that was the standard I used. Also in our lab, we participate in performance audits from outside sources where we buy reagents or things we want to test. We can buy them where we know what's in them and see how we work, but we also get tested with unknowns to see if we can meet those standards. Collecting and analyzing duplicates and replicate samples from the field and splitting your samples in the lab, also very important. And one thing I've discovered the hard way is if you're doing something new, you want to run that test or that analysis many, many times to make sure that you're doing it well. And if you can, check out your analysis against another method of doing that. Excuse me. One of the things we did in our lab was when we switched to a different way of analyzing chlorophyll, we bought a new meter. We actually ran 1 whole year of samples. That was 7,000 samples on our older instrument and our newer instrument, just so that we can make that comparison and feel comfortable that the new one was getting the same results and good results. Okay, next slide. So you also want to see what the extent of comparability is of your sample. How do your methods compare to what other people are doing? How do your methods compare to past studies? In some cases, how do they compare to the results of professionals? And we're seeing a lot more of that in the published papers in citizen science, and that is very rewarding to see those very good comparisons. Next, please. And so, oh, there it is. And so in our program, again, we actually had our staff go out and do some measurements, and we had our volunteers do the measurements. We did it when the volunteers were with the staff, and then we had them separate from the staff. And that gave us confidence to say that in this particular measurement, which happened to be of water clarity, the volunteers were getting results comparable to those of the staff. Okay, next slide. And so here's my favorite pizza example, when we ordered in 2 small pizzas and got 2 that are clearly quite different in size. And this is just a reminder to make sure that your methods are comparable to others. They don't have to be exactly the same, but that you know what the differences are and how they do compared to each other. Next, please. In some cases, there's not a way to determine if you are getting the correct, or what we would call the right answer. And one of those is with a measurement of water clarity called the Secchi transparency. We don't know what the accurate and the actual number is. Wonderfully, the Maine's Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program has come up with a Secchi Simulator, which we now have all our volunteers run through. And it's fantastic, and I recommend anybody who is on here interested in that and to go check it out, where you will actually choose what kind of a lake you want, what kind of clarity, and the right-hand screen shows the graphic of the Secchi disk going down into the water, and you mark where it disappears from view. And then you find out how you've rated, and then you can try it again. Very, very handy, very, very useful. Next slide, please. And another thing that you need to think about is how much data is good enough compared with what you wanted to get and what you did get in. And these 4 slides are of water clarity, where the bars are the view of the Secchi disk from the surface down into the water. The first graph shows a full season of monitoring. This is what we all hope for, the gold standard. The second shows, what if we sampled every other week instead of every week? Is that good enough? The third, well, the volunteer was a little bit busy and didn't get out very much, maybe a little bit in the spring, a little bit in the middle of summer, and a little bit in the end of the season. Is that good enough for what you want to use the data for? Very important. And then what we sometimes see also is in the 4th graph, where we have our volunteer who's gone out once in the early season and once in the end of the season. And I would not use this data to make averages for water clarity during the season, but it's also still useful to actually have that data and the measurements that are made that time. Okay, next slide. And then representativeness. Now, when I'm training my volunteers, one of the things I say to them is, when you're collecting this water sample, you're putting it in this bottle, you are saying that this measures the water in this lake or this estuary or this river at this time. And that's pretty presumptuous, I think. And that's the challenge we have with all our monitoring, is to make sure that what we're doing is really representing the true environmental condition. The 2 charts here were made by one of our volunteers in our program over one season. And what we see in the chart is that the water clarity, those bars, hang down very low. It's very clear for the first part of the season. And then all of a sudden, it decreases dramatically. In the bottom chart, where we also are monitoring the chlorophyll levels, we can see it's very low during the most of the season. In mid-season, all of a sudden, the chlorophyll and the algae levels jump high. So if you were only going to pick one of the data points from that, which would you say is representative of the season? And that's hard to say. And that's why it's very, very important to have data that span the collection of what you're interested in. Okay, next. So ultimately, people will say that the most important factor in determining the level of quality is the cost of being wrong. I like to turn it around and say that what it really is the benefits of being correct. And as we know, it's really hard to make bad data good, but it's really important to do the best we can and be able to document how good and what high quality our data has. Next, please. So just a couple hints of what Watershed Watch does for our program. We own all our equipment. We have annual recalibration. At the end of October, everything comes back to us. We calibrate our Secchi depths, our sampler lengths, thermometers, salinity meters, refractometers. We have about, 125 dissolved oxygen kits in use each year. We bring them in, take them all apart, empty everything. We get all new reagents for all kits all year, just to make sure we know that's the same. And then during the summer, at one point, all our volunteers come in with their kits. We have a big jug of water that I've bubbled nitrogen through to lower the oxygen content. And all our volunteers test their kit against that jug of water. So we can easily see if someone's making a mistake. They can ask us questions, and we can actually see what the range is of many volunteers sampling that one jug of water during the day. And we also put our meters on that and to see how that relates well. And it has been an excellent quality assurance situation for us. We're also known as being very careful with our labware washing. It's a 5-day process. And also, as we're going through glassware washing with having many students in our lab, we label each step so that everybody knows what everybody else has been doing. Next, please. So our program is a combination of field and lab, with our volunteers doing quite a fair amount of field monitoring, and then our staff and our lab doing the things that are not so easy for our volunteers to do in the field. And we're very fortunate in that part that we are at the university and we do have access to the research grade laboratories. And next. And as a quick summary of the program, we're now in our 30th year. We've got about 400 volunteers monitoring over 250 sites, a third lakes and ponds, third rivers and streams, and third coastal. And next. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. And again, if anyone has questions for the panelists, please submit a question in the chat function and send to all panelists, and we'll get to those questions at the end. Thank you again so much, Linda. Now I'll hand it over to Ginny Monosmith, the ALLARM Assistant Director.
Linda, thanks for taking the time to walk us through those steps of starting up a volunteer monitoring program and also all of those QA elements. I'm going to continue to talk along those lines, looking at additional components of a monitoring program, and then also how service providers can help volunteers build credibility into their programs. Next. So to start off, I'd like to take a minute to introduce ALLARM, which, as Julie mentioned, is the acronym for the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. ALLARM is based at Dickinson College, which is in South Central Pennsylvania, and we began in 1986 to investigate whether or not acid deposition was having an impact on Pennsylvania streams. And from the get-go, ALLARM engaged volunteers in the project and trained them how to measure alkalinity and pH for a week. And one of the outcomes from that project that we didn't really anticipate was that there was this overwhelming amount of interest throughout the state by people who are not only willing but wanted to volunteer their time and the resources to monitor their local streams and learn more about health. And the project really helped to shape the mission of ALLARM, and ALLARM's provided assistance to communities that are interested in developing and implementing these stream monitoring programs ever since. And ALLARM aims to support volunteers to answer questions that they themselves have about the streams in their community. The volunteers are the ones to set the agenda, and then ALLARM helps them to achieve their monitoring goals. Next slide. So as Linda mentioned, there's many components of a monitoring program, and the amount of time and effort you need to devote to each of them is going to be different depending on your program's goals and what the monitoring questions are. And looking at this, at a minimum, your program should have a written study design and a monitoring methods manual. And you'll also want to have a plan in place for training the volunteers and how you're going to follow up with them. Other components listed, like having a quality assurance project plan and strategies for recruiting and retaining volunteers, plus ways to evaluate and assess your program, are also recommended. And these elements will only elevate your program as you brainstorm and work to develop these resources. Documentation of these components, too, is really the backbone of any successful monitoring program. You know, data in general are often met with criticism, especially in this age of social media and fake news, but when they're accurate and they're backed up by documentation, they're better understood, and then they're more likely to be used, which of course is the ultimate goal. So the bottom line is, if people can't trust the data because they don't know what was involved in generating them, they're going to have a hard time using them. So do your program justice and write it all down, because data quality ultimately does lead to data credibility. Developing the study design, as Linda talked about, is the critical first step when you're building a sound monitoring program. And service providers, we can play an important role in this process because we can facilitate it and also make recommendations on the monitoring methods that are used and the quality control measures that should be implemented. So for example, a group, they should measure parameters that are going to help to answer their monitoring questions. And they should use equipment that's appropriate for how they plan to use their data, as Linda went through. And the service provider comes to the table knowing this information. Next slide, please. So the second step in building a sound program is to figure out, what do you need to do to collect credible data? You know, why should folks trust your data? What do you have to do to make sure that they can be used not only by your group, but by others as well? And the steps that you follow to achieve this can be described either in your monitoring methods manual or in a standalone document that's called a Quality Assurance Project Plan, or a QAP. And the service provider often takes a lead role in writing the QAP, and EPA, they have a really useful manual that outlines the process of it, and it's specifically written for volunteer monitoring programs, and you can see that link here in the presentation, and it's also directly available from EPA's website. Next. The monitoring methods manual is also usually created by the service provider, but unlike the QAP, it's used extensively by the volunteers. And if you're creating a program from scratch, it's worthwhile to take the time to learn about the procedures that other well-established programs use. And, you know, if their program and data use goals align with yours, it may even make sense to adopt their procedures instead of reinventing the wheel yourself, because after all, they've already been tested. And using standardized products promotes consistency and then ultimately comparability, as Linda mentioned. And comparability improves the confidence in the data. And then, you know, when the data users, whoever is going to look at the data and use it, when they're confident in it, they're more likely to use it. The monitoring methods manual also serves the basis for the volunteer training, which then leads me to volunteer engagement. Next, please. And it's important to have a plan in place to train volunteers how to collect and analyze their samples, and then manage the data that they collect. And this role is often shared between the service provider and the volunteer monitoring coordinator. And when you think about training volunteers, you want to present the information in a variety of ways, including lots of hands-on activities. Because the volunteer, you know, they need to learn about the methods and the procedures, those action items that they're going to be doing, the practice. but it's also useful for them to learn about the parameters and their expected ranges and what all of those values that they're going to be collecting mean. It's a lot of information to throw at someone all at once, but understanding the complete picture and how everything fits together really helps to reduce measurement error, and it also builds the capacity of the volunteers. ALLARM always suggests to send the volunteers home with printed materials so that they can review and reference them later on and include who they can contact when they have questions. And of course, when any of us learn anything new, we need to learn it again and again, and then practice it until we get the hang of it. And that's why after the initial training, it's key to hold some follow-up meetings to answer any questions they have and refresher trainings to review those methods. And then with certification, it's important to have a way to measure the accuracy of the data that's being collected. And this can be done by the service provider or the volunteer monitoring coordinator through things like field audits and side-by-side sampling, or testing a sample and sending it to a lab to verify. Next, please. So it's always a great idea to take the time to evaluate and assess your program. There could be an entire webinar focused on this topic alone. And we often steer folks to our friends at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology who have a ton of experience in the evaluation and assessment field. And they have some really great resources that are tailored specifically for citizen science projects. Next slide, please. As a service provider, ALLARM really supports communities from the beginning stage of the study design to the final stages of sharing results and outcomes. And so let's take a closer look at this relationship between the service provider and the community. And for the example, I've chosen to highlight a group that ALLARM has had the pleasure to partner with since 2003, the Antietam Watershed Association. And when the group determined that collecting baseline data on the health of streams within the Antietam Watershed, ALLARM facilitated and mentored the group through the study design process. A small group of members from the Watershed Association were designated as the study design committee, and they helped to define their monitoring program by answering questions that were specific to their group and also how they plan to use the data that they collected. And then ALLARM as a service provider helped to fill in the technical aspects and made sure that the monitoring plan that they ended up with was scientifically sound and would help them to produce credible data that they could then use. ALLARM, or AWA, the Antietam Watershed Association, they don't have a co-op, so their quality plan is written directly within their monitoring methods manual that ALLARM wrote. Next slide, please. And AWA they were solely responsible for finding and recruiting the volunteers for their program, because they're the ones that know the members of their community and where and how to find and recruit them. And once they pulled together a team, ALLARM guided them through the rest of the monitoring process, all the way to sharing all of their results. And that process can take up to 8-10 years to complete, depending on, again, the goal and the monitoring questions. But during that time, there's always multiple monitoring trainings and follow-up meetings for refreshers. ALLARM also certifies the AWA volunteers every year through duplicate sample analysis, where they send in samples to ALLARM. And sometimes at meetings where we can sample alongside the volunteer, or we create and bring samples with known concentrations for the volunteers to measure. Next slide. So the ALLARM Lab has 3 main roles, how we work with volunteers. We provide external QC support for the purpose of certifying monitors. We evaluate monitoring equipment, and then we develop and test those monitoring methods. Next slide. So looking at quality control support, we've been doing this through the Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds, or CSA, and as Julie mentioned, we serve as the quality control lab for volunteers that measure water quality parameters in Pennsylvania. And basically the way the program works is volunteers will go out, they will sample their stream as usual, and while they're there, they'll collect a second water sample that they then send along with your QC form to ALLARM. At the lab, we'll measure the sample using the same equipment they did, as well as other equipment that we have in our lab. And we'll compare the results from the volunteer to what we got, and then send those comparisons back to the volunteer, and along with a certificate if they pass, or we make recommendations for improvement if they don't, and then ask them to send in another water sample after they're able to incorporate the suggestions. As I mentioned, this type of quality control is called duplicate sample analysis, and for the volunteers that we train, they participate in this process at least twice a year in the first year that they begin monitoring. Once immediately after they're trained, and then again about 6 months later. And we have the timing set up this way to, one, make sure that they're following the procedures that they learned at the workshop correctly, and that the equipment that they received is working properly from the very beginning. Because can you imagine if a volunteer waited 6 months to then send a water sample, only to then realize that maybe a simple step was skipped, or their meter was faulty, or their reagents were expired? That would be such a huge disappointment if they had to essentially throw out all of that data that they worked so hard to collect. The other reason that we have this timetable set up is to build the confidence of the volunteer. There's no better motivation builder than to go out to your stream for the first or second time, follow everything that you learned at the workshop, you go and you send your sample to the lab, and you get your results back with a certificate verifying the data you collected. It's super exciting. And then after volunteers participate in this the first year, they then send in samples on an annual basis afterwards. And we also follow the same approach with volunteers in the Chesapeake Watershed through the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which is a project funded by EPA's Chesapeake Bay program, and that's a newer collaboration for ALLARM. Next slide, please. The second function of the lab is to evaluate monitoring equipment, and we began doing this really during our acid rain days. We gave out kits to measure alkalinity, and then we realized that they weren't able to really measure low concentrations very accurately. And so we recognized early on that we needed to have more experience using the equipment and understand it better before we could make the recommendations. And as we began shifting from an organization that focused solely on acid rain monitoring to one that looked at a wide array of questions, we needed to evaluate equipment that measured for many different parameters. And clearly, before you can train somebody on how to use the equipment at a workshop, you need to be comfortable using and maintaining the equipment and following the procedures yourself. So, it can be a tricky process to evaluate equipment. Sometimes some equipment doesn't perform the same in a lab setting versus a field setting, and it's difficult to estimate how long the equipment might last or perform properly. But whenever we go through this process, we evaluate it for accuracy and precision, and we take a closer look at the sensitivity and the specs and how easy it is to use. And we have multiple people within the organization test the equipment at a number of ranges and concentrations and compare the results to each other as well as to other equipment we have in our lab using standards and knowns and sometime outside lab results as well. And, as an example, when we first started developing our shale gas monitoring program in 2009, we knew that we needed to identify a meter that was going to accurately and precisely measure conductivity, which is the basis of that protocol. And at the time, we didn't have much experience using volunteer-friendly conductivity meters outside of the ones that we really didn't have much confidence in. So we started searching from square one. We combed the water quality monitoring supply catalogs, the internet, other method manuals, monitoring listservs, to try to find all of the meters that were on the market that were less than $200 that would measure both conductivity and total dissolved solids. So once we had this compiled list, we started to apply filters to remove meters that didn't meet some of our minimum criteria. So things like if a meter couldn't be calibrated, that wasn't something we were interested in using. And we purchased meters and we ran them through some accuracy and precision tests. And then when we had it narrowed down, we recruited folks from Dickinson to participate in an activity to, again, evaluate accuracy and precision, but also ask folks to comment on their experience. So was the meter easy to use and calibrate? Could they see the numbers easily? Were the buttons easy to find and to press? And could they navigate through the different functions and modes easily? Because, data quality is a really important aspect of choosing the equipment, but the user experience is also part of the volunteer's experience as well. And if there are two options with similar specs, you should, choose the one that's easier to operate. And in this case, we had a rare outcome, which was great, that the Lamont Tracer Pocket Tester scored the highest in all of the categories we were looking at, so it was easy for us to recommend. And as a bonus, Lamont's a company that solely focuses on environmental monitoring, so you can go and pick up the phone and call them and speak to a technician really anytime you want, and in my book that makes a difference. Next slide, please. So the third function of the ALLARM Lab is to monitor and research our local stream. And as a water monitoring organization, we're obviously interested in assessing stream health in our own community. But I mention it here because it gives us the opportunity to develop and test field methods and the equipment firsthand, and by many people thanks to the amazing student staff that ALLARM has. And I feel that you really should experience what you're trying to teach other people to do. Go through the motions yourself. If there's a step in the SOPs that you don't really want to do or you don't need to do it and it doesn't affect data quality, take a step back before asking a volunteer to do it. As a service provider, we're here to make sure that the volunteers are collecting credible and useful data. But it's also our role to make sure that the procedures are safe and that they're practical. And, finally, I'll end with this one thought. Volunteers inherently produce credible data. They care about the data, and they've devoted their personal time and energy and resources to be trained how to collect the information simply because they want to, not because they have to. They want their data to be good, they want them to be looked at, and they want them to be used to make a difference, both within their own community and elsewhere. And helping them to create and implement a monitoring program with built-in credibility is going to help them to achieve that.